Jackson Bennett had learned long ago that silence was its own kind of armor. Every creak of the wind against the boards of his run-down cottage, every distant echo of laughter from Maple Hollow's main street, all faded into the hush he'd built around himself. The locals, wary of what they didn't understand, called him the Phantom, a shadowy figure glimpsed only in the early hours, a man said to speak more to the trees than to any living soul. Whispers traveled faster than the chill through the town, but Jackson paid them no mind. He had made his peace with loneliness, or so he told himself, out there on the ragged fringe of Maple Hollow. But that night, the world seemed determined to shatter the stillness he'd so carefully constructed. Clouds, thick and furious, rolled over the horizon, swallowing the last gold of sunset. The first rumble of thunder shook the windows in their frames, and Jackson moved quietly from room to room, bracing for the storm. He had lived through tempests both within and without. He understood the language of lightning, the warning cry of wind. He checked the barn doors, secured the shutters, and settled into the faded armchair that was nearly as old and battered as he was. He had almost drifted into uneasy sleep when a new sound pierced the night, a frantic, unnatural noise, half a scream, half a plea, carried on the wind. Jackson jerked upright, every muscle tensed as if the battlefield had suddenly returned. It wasn't an echo from memory. It was here, now, close. For a moment he hesitated, war raging inside him. The smart thing, the safe thing, was to stay put. Let whatever creature was out there find its own way. But something, perhaps that stubborn core of decency that refused to die, drove him up and out into the storm. Rain sliced the world into shifting sheets of shadow and silver. His boots squelched through the mud as he skirted the side of the house, heart pounding, eyes straining to make sense of the chaos. There, slumped just beyond the broken fence, was a figure, a horse wild and massive, its flanks trembling, its mane plastered to its neck by the downpour. The animal's eyes rolled white, every inch of it taut with pain and panic. It tried to rise, failed, and let out a noise that clawed at something deep in Jackson's chest. The locals wouldn't have seen anything but danger. A wild Mustang, unpredictable, probably rabid or doomed. But Jackson saw something else. A creature as battered by life as he was, teetering on the edge of survival. Lightning forked overhead, illuminating the desperate struggle in the animal's eyes. For a heartbeat, Jackson faltered, his mind torn between the urge to help and the old protective habit of staying hidden. Nobody would blame him for turning away. No one would even know. But he knew. And that, in the end, was enough. He approached slowly, hands held wide, voice soft but steady above the howl of the wind. The Mustang snorted, teeth flashing, hooves churning the sodden earth in warning. Jackson edged closer, crooning nonsense. A song, a memory, a promise that he meant no harm. The horse tried to lunge away, but its left foreleg buckled, and it crashed heavily to the ground, breathing ragged. Jackson's training kicked in. He talked to the Mustang as he would to a wounded soldier, letting tone and patience do the work. Words could not. He moved deliberately, scanning for obvious injuries, deep gashes along the haunch, blood mixed with mud, a wicked cut on the leg. Every instinct screamed at him to move faster, to do more, but rushing would only make things worse. The rain was relentless, blinding. He coaxed the horse toward the shelter of his barn, using his own body as a shield against the wind. The Mustang fought him every step, wild eyes blazing with fear, But Jackson refused to back down. The battle became a dance. Man against nature, man against himself. There were moments when he thought he'd have to let go, when the animal's terror threatened to overwhelm them both. But in the end, sweat and stubbornness prevailed. Inside the barn, the world narrowed to the scent of wet hay, the shuddering breath of the Mustang, and the steady drip of rain from the eaves. Jackson worked by lantern light, tending wounds with the care of someone who knew how much pain could be hidden beneath a brave front. The horse's sides heaved, muscles twitching, but it allowed him, barely, to clean the wounds and cover them with makeshift bandages. Jackson whispered to the creature, old words of comfort he'd almost forgotten he knew. When the worst of the storm passed and exhaustion pressed heavy on his shoulders, Jackson sat back on his heels, studying the animal before him. The Mustang was a survivor, battered but unbroken, and Jackson saw himself reflected in those wary, indomitable eyes. He named the horse Thunder, for the storm that had brought them together, for the chaos and possibility both had weathered. That night, with the wind finally easing and the world washed clean, Jackson found himself changed in some small, indefinable way. The line between solitude and connection had shifted, just a little. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel quite so much like a ghost haunting the edge of town. Unbeknownst to Jackson, his choice to help Thunder would become the first stone cast into the still pond of Maple Hollow, sending ripples that would reach farther than he could ever imagine. But for now, all that mattered was the steady, shared heartbeat of man and Mustang beneath the battered roof, sheltering each other from the storm. Morning in Maple Hollow always arrived slow and misty, the sun struggling to break through heavy clouds after a night of thunder. For Jackson Bennett, dawn was usually a time of solitude, when the world felt quieter, his past less pressing. But on this day, everything was different. There was no gentle waking, only the memory of last night's chaos and the uneasy knowledge that a wild Mustang now rested, if it could be called rest, inside his battered barn. Jackson shrugged on his old jacket and boots, the weight of responsibility heavy on his shoulders. As he stepped outside, the air was sharp with the smell of wet earth and the lingering sting of ozone. A few wary birds pecked at the puddles, but the land was still, watching, as if holding its breath for what would happen next. The barn, once the centerpiece of a small family farm, stood stubborn and tired. He could hear the restless shifting of hooves before he even slid the door open. Thunder, the Mustang, was awake and alert, eyes wide and nostrils flaring at every sound. Overnight, the horse's coat had dried into a mottled mess of mud and blood, but there was a fire in him that refused to be dimmed. Jackson admired that, even as it made the task ahead seem impossible. He entered slowly, moving sideways, letting Thunder see every motion. The horse snorted, tossing his head, muscles tight and ready to bolt if only he could. Jackson spoke in a low voice, more for his own nerves than the animal's comfort, and offered a bucket of oats with an outstretched arm. Thunder pinned his ears and lunged, hooves striking the dirt, scattering the feed across the floor. Jackson flinched, but he did not give up. He gathered the spilled oats and set them near Thunder's good side, then retreated a few steps to give the Mustang space. Hunger and pride battled behind Thunder's eyes, but pride won. The horse turned away, limping to the darkest corner, refusing to eat. It went on like this for days. Jackson would clean the wounds, refresh the water, try again with oats or hay or even apples. Sometimes Thunder would lash out, kicking, snapping, eyes wild with a kind of terror that Jackson understood all too well. More than once, Jackson caught himself holding his breath, heart racing, remembering how it felt to be cornered, desperate, misunderstood. Maple Hollow's gossip swirled as always, growing in the absence of real news. A few curious townsfolk passed by, peering through the fence, whispering about the crazy phantom and his devil horse. But Jackson had learned to let the world's judgment roll off his back. What mattered now was here, in the barn, a battle of patience, fear, and the faintest possibility of trust. He worked quietly, letting routine become its own kind of communication. He replaced the old bedding, patched leaks in the roof, made the barn warmer and safer, not just for Thunder, but for himself. In the evenings, Jackson would sit nearby, mending harnesses or whittling pieces of wood, humming fragments of old songs. Sometimes he told stories, not expecting Thunder to understand, but hoping the rhythm of his voice would become familiar, less threatening. Days turned to weeks. The Mustang's wounds healed, but the wall between man and animal remained. Thunder would accept water, sometimes graze a little when Jackson left food, but he never allowed the veteran to come too close. Any sudden movement, any hint of a raised hand, and the horse would retreat in panic, as if expecting a blow. The struggle wasn't just Thunder's. Jackson felt his own scars opening, old memories bubbling up, the way fear could twist inside. How hard it was to believe in kindness after pain. He saw himself in Thunder's mistrust, recognized the same flinching at any hint of affection. He remembered nights in distant deserts, the comrades he'd lost, the wounds that would never quite heal. He remembered, too, the comfort that could be found in quiet company, the small mercies of survival. One night, as rain drummed gently on the barn roof, Jackson sat with his back against a hay bale, exhaustion blurring the edges of his thoughts. Thunder stood across the stall, restless but less agitated. The air was thick with the scent of horse and hay and something new, a tentative acceptance, fragile as spider silk. Jackson let his eyes close, letting the soft breathing of the Mustang lull him. In that space between waking and sleep, man and animal found a moment's peace, the hard work of trust beginning in silence. In Maple Hollow, time crept forward. The townsfolk watched, half fearful, half fascinated, as the phantom and his Mustang endured. No miracles happened overnight. There were setbacks, days when Thunder refused food, nights when panic seemed to erase any progress. But Jackson did not give up. Each tiny victory, a mouthful of oats, a moment of calm, became its own kind of hope. They were two souls, battered but unbroken, learning slowly how to share the world again. In the steady rhythm of care and persistence, something fragile took root. It was not yet friendship, not yet trust, but it was the beginning of both. And in the cold, uncertain light of autumn, that was enough. The days grew shorter in Maple Hollow, the air sharpening with the promise of winter. Jackson fell into a rhythm defined by small routines, the kind that gave his world shape and meaning even when hope felt like a distant memory. Each morning, the barn was his first destination, and each night, his last. The struggle to win Thunder's trust had become more than a duty. It was a lifeline, something to anchor him when old ghosts threatened to pull him under. Thunder changed, bit by bit, as the autumn deepened. He stopped recoiling quite so far when Jackson approached, though his eyes remained wary. The wildness in the Mustang's spirit was still there, but something softer, almost curious, flickered beneath the surface. Jackson began to read the horse's moods, Not just the obvious tension in his stance or the nervous twitch of his ears, but the subtler shifts. The way Thunder's breathing would slow when Jackson sat nearby, or how he would tilt his head to listen to the soft cadence of a story. Trust, Jackson realized, wasn't a leap. It was 1,000 tiny steps, sometimes forward, sometimes back. The old barn, which had once felt cold and hollow, came alive with the sound of work and quiet company. Jackson patched the roof, sanded the splintered doors, and replaced boards rotted from years of neglect. He talked as he worked, half to himself, half to Thunder. Some days he'd share stories from a time before pain and regret became his closest companions. Sunlit afternoons spent fishing with his father, or the day his sister taught him how to whistle through a blade of grass. Other times, the stories took on the bitter edge of memory. Tales of sand and gunfire, the endless waiting for news that never came, the faces he could never quite forget. It was easier to speak in the barn, surrounded by hay and dust, than it was anywhere else. There, Jackson's past lost some of its power, and the silence became a balm instead of a burden. Thunder, for his part, listened. Maybe it was only the comfort of routine, but the Mustang began to drift closer when Jackson worked or rested, drawn by the rhythm of a quiet life. When Jackson sat with his back to the stall, Thunder sometimes pressed his nose to the boards, huffing warm breath into the space between them. These moments, small as they were, meant everything. But for all the slow progress, darkness still crept in at the edges. Jackson's nightmares, never far away, came more often as the nights grew long. Sometimes, in the deep hours before dawn, the old terror would seize him. The memory of explosions, the panic of being lost and hunted. He'd wake with his heart pounding, breath ragged, the taste of fear sour in his mouth. On those nights, the urge to retreat, to rebuild his walls and shut out the world, was nearly overwhelming. One bitterly cold night, the nightmares came harder than usual. Jackson awoke on the barn floor, tangled in a blanket, cold sweat slicking his skin. He gasped for air, the walls pressing in, the wind howling like distant gunfire. He barely registered the sound of hooves until Thunder, drawn by some instinct, reached his side of the stall. The Mustang pawed anxiously at the boards, snorting and pacing. In his panic, Jackson reached out, not knowing what he wanted. Reassurance, maybe, or just proof that he was still here. Thunder didn't bolt. Instead, the horse lowered his head, pressing his warm, velvet nose against Jackson's shoulder through the gap in the boards. For a long moment, neither moved, the connection as fragile and unexpected as a miracle. The simple, living presence of the Mustang steadied Jackson, anchored him to the present. The terror receded, replaced by a fierce gratitude, a recognition that somehow, caring for Thunder had become a reason to keep going. After that night, their bond deepened. Jackson began to let himself hope that maybe, just maybe, Thunder trusted him too. He brushed the Mustang's mane, careful and patient, wincing as old scars in his own hands pulled tight. He learned how to soothe Thunder with a gentle touch, how to let the horse's breath and heartbeat guide him out of his own storms. Each day, their silences grew more comfortable, filled with understanding that didn't require words. Jackson also noticed the changes in himself. He felt lighter, more present, as if the daily rituals with Thunder had begun to heal wounds deeper than flesh. The cottage, once just a shelter, started to feel like a home again. On good days, he carved small wooden animals, leaving them on the barn windowsill, gifts for Thunder, or for anyone who cared to notice. Maple Hollow, for all its suspicion and rumor, remained at a cautious distance. Children whispered stories of the ghostly man and his wild horse, peering through fence rails before running off in bursts of laughter. But Jackson no longer shrank from their curiosity. He knew, deep down, that the world outside his land might never understand him, or Thunder. That was all right. For now, the quiet bond they shared was enough, a small beacon against the long shadows of the past. Jackson wasn't sure what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time in years, he was willing to find out. Thunder had given him a reason to hope again, and in the hush of the barn, their unspoken friendship grew, strong and sure as the changing seasons. Winter was settling in around Maple Hollow, wrapping the valley in a chill that seemed to seep into the bones of man and beast alike. Jackson Bennett woke each morning to the world rimed in frost, his breath hanging pale in the air as he made his rounds from cottage to barn. By now, Thunder had become a constant, silent companion. Their routine, hard-won over weeks of patience, lent Jackson's days a quiet purpose he had almost forgotten. But as the season deepened, Thunder's behavior began to change. The Mustang, once so withdrawn and wary, now seemed agitated and restless. Jackson noticed it first on a wind-bitten morning, when Thunder wouldn't settle, pacing in his stall with nostrils flared and eyes darting toward the woods beyond the pasture. At first, Jackson assumed it was just the wild energy of a horse unused to confinement. But soon it became clear that something more was stirring beneath Thunder's skin. At odd hours, day and night, the Mustang would prick his ears toward the forest, snorting or whinnying with a growing urgency that Jackson couldn't explain. Sometimes he'd stomp and throw his head as if warning off some invisible threat. Other times he'd stare at the tree line, frozen, listening. It set Jackson's nerves on edge, reminding him of how, in combat, animals often sensed danger before men did. One night, a heavy snow began to fall, blanketing the farm and all of Maple Hollow in silent white. The world shrank to a hush, broken only by the sound of wind in the trees. Jackson spent hours tending the barn, checking the old roof for leaks, making sure Thunder was warm and fed. He tried to reassure the horse with a gentle hand, but Thunder remained restless, pawing the straw and pacing in agitation. The next morning, as dawn broke blue and bitter cold, Jackson found the barn door hanging wide open, snow swirling across the threshold. Thunder was gone. Jackson's heart slammed against his ribs. He hadn't heard the escape, hadn't dreamed the Mustang would dare the deep drifts and unknown dangers of the wild. For one frozen moment, old fears came surging back. The barn felt emptier than it had in years, the air hollow and sharp. Without a second thought, Jackson grabbed his coat and boots and plunged into the snow, following the deep, erratic prints that Thunder had left behind. The tracks led away from the barn, across the pasture, and straight into the woods. The forest was a world transformed, every branch and path muffled beneath the snow. Jackson's breath came hard and fast, his limbs aching as he forced his way through thickets and tangled underbrush. He called for Thunder, the name lost in the hush of falling snow. Panic warred with logic. He told himself the horse was strong, that Thunder had survived worse, but the wildness of the winter woods was unforgiving. Deeper and deeper Jackson pressed, his mind reeling with the thought that he might lose the only friend he'd let himself trust in years. Then, somewhere ahead, a frantic whinny pierced the hush. Jackson stumbled toward the sound, breaking through a screen of frozen brush. He emerged on the edge of a narrow creek, the water running dark and swift beneath a skin of ice. There, on the far bank, Thunder stood with his head low, mane tangled with snow and mud. The Mustang was not alone. Curled up at Thunder's feet was a little girl, no older than 7 or 8, shivering violently, her thin coat woefully inadequate against the cold. She looked impossibly small, her face drawn and pale, hair tangled over her eyes. Thunder stood protectively over her, his body turned against the wind, shielding her from the worst of the elements. Each time she whimpered or tried to move, the Mustang lowered his head as if to comfort her, standing guard as steadfastly as any loyal dog. Jackson's mind reeled at the sight, a lost child alone in the woods, guarded by a horse who, only months ago, would have run from the touch of a human. He understood, with a jolt, that Thunder's restlessness hadn't been for nothing. The horse had sensed something was wrong, something that even Jackson's keenest instincts had missed. Wading into the creek, icy water numbing his boots, Jackson reached the girl's side. Thunder snorted and stamped, refusing to budge until Jackson murmured quiet reassurances, moving with the slow, gentle patience he had learned over months of hardship. He knelt and gently gathered the girl into his arms, feeling the tremor of her tiny frame. She was light as a feather, half frozen and barely conscious. Thunder fell in beside them as Jackson struggled back through the woods, his body a warm shadow guiding the way home. The walk was long and desperate, but together, man and horse carried the child out of the darkness and back into the safety of Maple Hollow. It was only later, when the girl was swaddled in blankets beside Jackson's fire and Thunder stood watchful at the window, that Jackson realized the miracle of what had happened. Thunder's instincts, his wild courage, had not only saved a child's life, they had called Jackson back into the world, reminding him that trust, once given, could grow into something strong enough to save more than one soul. The snow had not yet melted from Jackson's boots when he stepped through the outskirts of Maple Hollow, carrying the rescued girl in his arms, with Thunder trailing close behind. The morning air was brittle, heavy with the echo of last night's storm, and his breath fogged the air as he moved toward the heart of town. Each step was a test of strength and resolve. The girl's weight seemed to increase with every yard, her head lolling on his shoulder, hair still matted with frost. At first, the streets were quiet. Then, as Jackson drew near the square, faces appeared in windows, silhouettes shifting behind curtains. News traveled at the speed of curiosity in Maple Hollow, especially when the Phantom appeared in broad daylight, looking more haunted than ever, with a half-frozen child clutched to his chest and a wild Mustang at his heels. Within minutes, a crowd gathered, thickening with every step. He felt the weight of their eyes long before anyone dared speak. Fear and suspicion swirled in the icy air, fueled by old rumors and the unfamiliar sight of a man who'd kept to himself for years. Someone muttered, and the words, half accusation, half warning, rippled through the gathering. Mothers drew their children close. Men stepped forward with arms crossed, faces hard. Jackson stopped in the middle of the square. He was surrounded now, the circle tightening, with Thunder pawing nervously behind him, ears flicked back, tail swishing with agitation. The Mustang's presence only fueled the tension. No one in Maple Hollow had seen a horse quite like Thunder, and the animal's wildness seemed to unsettle the onlookers as much as the silent man who led him. Then someone shouted, asking where Jackson had found the girl. Another voice, sharper, demanded to know what he was doing out there in the woods with a child. The words struck Jackson with all the force of a winter wind. the old dread of being judged and found wanting rising up inside him. It would have been easier to retreat, to turn away and vanish back into the solitude that had long protected him. But the girl shivered in his arms, her tiny hands clinging to his coat, and he knew he could not abandon her now, or himself. Just as the pressure seemed ready to explode, a frantic cry pierced the crowd. Emily's mother burst through the ring of neighbors, her eyes wide with terror and hope. She flung herself toward Jackson, nearly collapsing in relief when she saw her daughter's face. Tears streaked down her cheeks as she reached for the child, and the girl stirred, blinking slowly, her lips forming her mother's name. Jackson knelt, lowering Emily into her mother's arms. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Every eye was fixed on the reunion. Then Emily, voice trembling and weak, told her story. How she had wandered too far from home. How the cold had crept into her bones. How she'd become lost and frightened in the woods. And then she spoke of Thunder, the great horse who had found her and stood over her as if guarding his own foal, and of the quiet man who had carried her back through the snow. The crowd, at first, listened in silence. But suspicion dies hard in small towns, and not all hearts were softened at once. Some still watched Jackson with narrow eyes, clinging to fear and half-remembered stories about his past. The mayor stepped forward, voice measured but skeptical, asking for details, pressing for answers Jackson struggled to give in the heat of so many stares. He answered quietly, explaining as best he could, but every word felt heavy, dredged from a place of old pain. Thunder, sensing the tension, whinnied softly, shifting his weight from hoof to hoof. The children, less afraid than their elders, crept forward, wide-eyed, marveling at the great horse and the way he stood protectively near the girl and her rescuer. Emily's mother, grateful beyond words, spoke in Jackson's defense, thanking him with a trembling voice for saving her daughter's life. That simple statement rippled through the crowd. First confusion, then a thawing of hostility as more people recognized the gravity of what had happened. Yet for Jackson, the moment was agony, a trial by fire, forced to confront the very thing he had hidden from for years, the scrutiny and judgment of his neighbors. He wanted nothing more than to vanish into the snow, to escape the harshness of their gaze. But he stood his ground, rooted by necessity and a flickering hope that things might change, even if only a little. Slowly, the mood began to shift. A few townsfolk offered hesitant words of thanks. Others simply nodded, acknowledging the reality of the day. The mayor, seeing the change, announced that Emily's rescue had been nothing short of miraculous, and that Jackson's actions had likely saved her life. It was not quite acceptance, not yet forgiveness, but it was a start. As the crowd dispersed, Emily's mother pressed a warm hand to Jackson's, tears still shining in her eyes. Thunder nuzzled the girl's shoulder, and Emily smiled weakly, her gratitude shining brighter than the winter sun. Jackson realized then that some walls, however high, could begin to crumble, not through grand gestures, but through small acts of courage and compassion, witnessed by many. He turned toward home as the morning light broke through the clouds, Thunder walking close by his side. Behind them, the whispers faded, replaced by the first faint hints of something new. Respect, curiosity, and the possibility that even the most misunderstood man could be seen, if only for a moment, in the clear light of day. Snow lingered for days after Emily's rescue, blanketing Maple Hollow in a hush that seemed almost reverent. Jackson Bennett moved quietly through his routines, tending Thunder at dawn, splitting wood when the sun was high, and mending fences as twilight crept in. Yet everything felt subtly changed. Where once he'd felt invisible, worse, unwanted, there now hovered a different energy, as if the air itself was lighter, as if the land was waiting. It started small. The first morning after returning Emily, Jackson found a basket on his porch, still warm bread wrapped in a checkered towel, a jar of honey, and a note written in a careful hand. "Thank you for saving our daughter. With gratitude, the Millers." Jackson stared at it for a long time, almost afraid to touch the unexpected kindness. When he brought the bread inside, its scent lingered, drawing memories of a time before silence and distance ruled his life. A day later, he heard footsteps crunching across the icy yard and looked up to see Dr. Harper, Maple Hollow's veterinarian, standing by the barn. The man was middle-aged, practical, with eyes that missed little and judged less. He came to check Thunder's wounds, to offer advice and supplies, but also to talk, not just about horses, but about the ways winter could press heavy on old bones and tired hearts. Jackson listened, saying little, but the vet's steady presence became a comfort. Dr. Harper's visits marked the start of something new. Word spread quietly through town that the Phantom wasn't so fearsome after all, that he'd risked his own safety to save a child, that his horse was wild but loyal. The change came in fits and starts, slow as the melt of snow in shaded corners. Sometimes, as Jackson walked to the store for flour or nails, he noticed a nod where before there had been only averted eyes. Someone left a pie on his porch, another time a knitted scarf, the yarn scratchy but bright against the dull winter gray. Children grew braver, daring each other to approach the fence and wave when Thunder was out in the paddock. The Mustang, always watchful, learned to tolerate their giggles and wide-eyed stares. Jackson, too, found himself smiling more, even if only in the privacy of the barn. The sting of isolation didn't vanish overnight, but the cold of loneliness was tempered by the warmth of cautious connection. Emily's family visited again, this time bringing her with them. She was shy, clutching her mother's hand, but her eyes sparkled when she saw Thunder. Jackson knelt so she could pet the Mustang's velvet nose, watching as her fear gave way to wonder. Emily's parents offered more thanks, voices thick with sincerity. They left behind a tin of cookies and promises to visit again come spring. At night, Jackson sometimes sat by the stove, piecing together these moments like fragments of a half-remembered song. The kindness of others felt fragile, easily shattered. Yet it gave him hope he hadn't dared nurture in years. He still woke from nightmares, sweat-drenched and haunted by battles far away. But Thunder was always there, waiting in the barn, greeting him with a nudge or a low rumble, reminding him that life could move forward, one small mercy at a time. There were setbacks, too. Not everyone in Maple Hollow was quick to forgive the past, real or imagined. Some neighbors still crossed the street to avoid him. Old gossip died hard in the bones of a small town. But the sharp edge of their suspicion dulled with each gesture, each day that Jackson proved himself simply by living, quietly, decently, without asking for anything in return. Jackson's mind wandered, on long evenings, to memories of a time before war and loss had marked him. He remembered a father who built fences and a mother who sang as she baked bread. He remembered laughter around a crowded table, and how a small kindness could ripple outward, softening even the hardest hearts. Those memories, once painful, became easier to bear as new ones formed. Thunder's trust, Emily's laughter, the unexpected pleasure of sharing pie and conversation with Dr. Harper. As the days stretched slowly toward spring, Jackson began to see himself differently. He was no longer just the phantom at the edge of town. He was a man learning to be a neighbor, a friend, even a mentor in small ways. He carved wooden animals and left them by the school fence, smiling when he saw them disappear into the pockets of delighted children. He taught Emily how to brush thunder and promised her parents he would watch out for her if ever she wandered near again. The boundaries of Jackson's world, once so tightly drawn, began to soften. The cottage, which had stood silent for years, now echoed with quiet footsteps and the laughter of guests. The barn, filled with the warm scent of horse and hay, felt less like a fortress and more like a sanctuary. One evening, as snow finally began to melt and the first hopeful shoots of green appeared along the fence line, Jackson paused outside his door. The sky was streaked with rose and gold, thunder grazing nearby, the sounds of life and possibility drifting up from the valley. For the first time in memory, Jackson felt not just accepted, but truly at home. And it all began with small gestures: a loaf of bread, a doctor's kindness, a child's smile, each one a light in the long winter, guiding him back to himself and to the heart of Maple Hollow. The world around Maple Hollow slowly traded its winter white for the golden glow of late summer, and then the riot of colors that marked the coming of fall. By the time the annual autumn festival approached, the leaves had turned brilliant amber and scarlet, spinning to the ground in every swirling wind. For years, the festival had passed Jackson Bennett by, just another distant sound, music and laughter echoing up the hill to his cottage where he watched from his window, unseen. But that year, things were different. A handwritten invitation arrived, carried by Dr. Harper himself. No simple note, but a genuine welcome from the festival committee, signed by neighbors who only months before wouldn't have spoken his name aloud. "We hope you'll come," it said, "and bring thunder. The children would love to see him." Jackson read the words twice, then a third time, feeling the old fear flicker in his chest. He tried to ignore the letter, telling himself it didn't matter, that he was content with the company of his horse and the slow, healing routine he had built. Yet as the day drew near, anxiety gave way to a quiet curiosity. When Emily's parents stopped by with jars of homemade preserves, they mentioned the festival too, their tone hopeful. Even Dr. Harper, never one for fuss, said he'd look forward to seeing them both there. In their eyes, Jackson saw not the suspicion that had long haunted him, but something closer to trust. When the morning of the festival dawned, a crisp, sunlit breeze swept the valley clean. Jackson rose early, nerves tight, hands unsteady as he saddled Thunder and brushed out the Mustang's glossy coat. He moved slowly, talking quietly to the horse, more for his own sake than Thunder's, trying to steady the memories that churned inside him. Crowds had never been easy, not since the war. But Thunder stood patiently, almost as if he understood this was something important, something that might change everything. Together, they made their way down the winding path from the cottage, golden leaves crunching beneath their feet. As they approached the festival grounds, a patchwork of tents and hay bales, music and the sweet smoke of roasting corn, Jackson could feel hundreds of eyes turning toward them. The crowd parted, a ripple of surprise and curiosity moving through the people. For a moment, Jackson wanted to turn back, to disappear into the safety of the trees. But then Emily came running from a booth, her braids flying, her smile as bright as any sunrise. "Thunder!" she cried, her laughter breaking the tension. The children rushed forward, some shy, others bold, drawn by stories of the wild Mustang and the man who'd saved a life. Jackson dismounted, steadying Thunder with a hand on the reins, letting the children come close, one at a time. Their wonder was contagious. Thunder, usually reserved, lowered his head for careful pats and accepted treats from small hands. Adults hung back, cautious but curious, watching to see what would happen. Jackson's heart hammered as he led Thunder into the center of the field. At Dr. Harper's gentle urging, he agreed to a short demonstration, showing how Thunder responded to his voice and gestures. He led the horse through simple steps, walking, trotting, turning on cue, then paused, uncertain, as the crowd waited. Emily spoke up, her voice strong and clear. She told the story of the day she was lost, how Thunder had found her and Jackson had carried her home. Jackson nodded, filling in details, his voice low but steady as he described how the Mustang's instincts had saved them both. The crowd listened, silent, the weight of old rumors slowly dissolving under the truth of the story. Something shifted in that moment, a leap of faith, not just for Jackson, but for everyone watching. The townspeople began to step forward, asking quiet questions, offering small thanks, reaching out in ways they never had before. Children pleaded for another trick, so Jackson showed them how Thunder could touch his hat or bow his head on command. Laughter and applause rang out, not mocking but genuine, wrapping him in warmth he hadn't felt in years. As the afternoon faded to evening, Jackson found himself invited to join a picnic table for cider and pie. Dr. Harper clapped him on the shoulder. Emily's father insisted he try his wife's apple cake, and a neighbor brought a cup of hot cider, pressing it into his hands with a smile. Thunder stood nearby, munching hay, drawing a steady stream of admirers. Jackson watched the scene unfold with a sense of disbelief and quiet joy. For the first time, he was not simply tolerated or pitied, but welcomed, a part of something larger than himself. As dusk settled and lanterns were lit, Jackson stood by Thunder, gazing up at the glowing windows of Maple Hollow. The scars of the past were still there, tender and real, but no longer all-consuming. The fear of judgment had not vanished, but it was answered now by something stronger: connection, acceptance, and the growing certainty that he and Thunder truly belonged. That night, as Jackson led Thunder back up the hill beneath the stars, the hush of autumn wrapped around them. He felt a lightness in his chest, a quiet gratitude blooming where grief had long held sway. The festival had given him a gift far greater than applause or thanks. It had offered him a place in the story of Maple Hollow, a seat at the table, a reason to hope for all the seasons still to come. The days after the autumn festival settled over Maple Hollow with the gentle certainty of falling leaves. For the first time in years, Jackson Bennett found himself at the heart of village talk, not as a figure of rumor, but as a name spoken with growing respect. Yet for Jackson, acceptance was still something new, fragile as the gold light streaming through his cottage window each morning. He felt it in the hesitant waves from neighbors and in the way children's laughter lingered along his fence line when they watched Thunder graze. Still, part of him waited for the warmth to fade, as if he were only a visitor in his own redemption. It was Dr. Harper who pushed him toward the next step. The vet arrived one evening, the first hints of frost crisping the air, and told Jackson the festival committee wanted him to speak, share his story, not just about Thunder, but about himself. Jackson almost laughed at the thought. Public speaking had never come easy. Crowds still made his chest tighten, memories threatening to claw their way to the surface. Yet Dr. Harper's eyes, steady and kind, did not flinch from the request. When the night of the town gathering came, The meeting hall glowed with lantern light, and Jackson felt every muscle tense as he stepped inside. Thunder waited outside, tied to the old oak where children lined up to feed him treats, their shouts muffled by the thick stone walls. Jackson took his place at the front of the room, feeling the weight of 100 eyes on him. Faces once closed off, now filled with cautious hope. He started slow, his voice rough as gravel, talking about the storm that brought thunder to his door, the wild fight to earn the horse's trust, and the night they found Emily in the woods. It might have ended there, a simple tale of survival and instinct. But as he spoke, Jackson felt the old dam of silence begin to crack. The truth pressed against his ribs, raw and insistent, and he knew if he didn't let it out, it would swallow him all over again. So Jackson spoke of his years away from Maple Hollow, the cost of battles no one in the room had seen. He spoke of brothers lost, of waking nights when he could not find rest, of the isolation that settled in his bones when he returned to find his world changed beyond recognition. He talked about how easy it was, after a while, to let fear turn into anger and anger into silence. He did not sugarcoat the loneliness or the ways it could warp a man's spirit. There was a stillness in the hall. No one whispered. No one shuffled their feet. Even the children seemed to understand that something important was unfolding. Jackson could not meet their eyes. Instead, he looked to thunder outside the window, the Mustang's silhouette steady against the dark. He described how, in thunder's wildness, he recognized his own, mistrustful, wounded, yet unwilling to be tamed by despair. The work of healing, he said, was slow, sometimes painful, but it began with a single act of courage, choosing to reach out, even when every instinct screamed for solitude. He finished by sharing the smallest things, how thunder nickered at dawn, how the sound of children playing had become a balm, how the kindness of the town had begun to stitch together a heart long torn by grief. His words were not grand, but honest, and that honesty was more powerful than he could have imagined. When Jackson finished, the silence lingered. Then, one by one, people stood, neighbors who had once crossed the street to avoid him, parents who had warned their children to keep away, men and women with their own quiet sorrows. They did not offer applause, but something deeper. They thanked him, not just for saving Emily or taming thunder, but for letting them see the truth behind the walls they'd built in their own hearts. Some approached, sharing their own stories, of loss, of fear, of the ways community could heal if given a chance. The mayor asked Jackson to help with the town's next charity drive. A teacher invited him to talk with her students about horses and courage. Dr. Harper clapped him on the back and said nothing, but his smile was the clearest welcome of all. Children who had feared the phantom now ran to greet him, eager to hear about thunder, to ask questions about wild horses and what it meant to be brave. Jackson felt their trust like sunlight on his skin, warm, unexpected, and fiercely alive. Even the adults began to look him in the eye, their old caution transformed into empathy and admiration. Rumors faded as new stories took root, built on truth and kindness instead of old suspicion. Thunder became a legend, a living symbol of Maple Hollow's second chances. People from neighboring towns came to see the Mustang and the quiet man who had risked everything for trust. The barn, once a fortress, became a place where strangers lingered, where laughter mixed with the steady thump of hooves. For Jackson, the most remarkable change was within himself, a sense of belonging, of purpose, and of gratitude so sharp it sometimes brought him to his knees. The night air outside was cold as Jackson walked home, but he carried with him the warmth of acceptance. A fire kindled not by grand gestures, but by the steady, stubborn work of opening his heart. For the first time, he realized he was not alone. And neither was anyone else who dared, even once, to reach across the darkness and say, "I see you. I understand. Welcome home." Maple Hollow's winter faded into a gentle, lingering spring. The snow that once muffled the land melted into swollen streams and soft green shoots pushing through thawed earth. With the return of birdsong and sunlight, Jackson Bennett found himself standing on a threshold he'd once thought forever closed. The days no longer blurred together in the gray sameness of survival. Each morning, there was purpose. Jackson's cottage, once shrouded in silence and shadow, grew lively with activity. At first, it was only Thunder's heavy steps and snorts in the early dawn, the comforting sounds of a creature who trusted him. But as word of Jackson's transformation spread, his porch became a resting spot for neighbors carrying small gifts, a sack of oats for Thunder, wildflowers from children, sometimes a basket of eggs or a pie. Jackson accepted each kindness quietly. His gratitude often shone more in a nod or a steady handshake than in words. It wasn't long before the children of Maple Hollow gathered at his fence each afternoon. They peered between rails, chattering about Thunder, daring each other to inch closer. Emboldened by stories of the Mustang's rescue and Jackson's bravery. Some afternoons, Jackson invited them into the paddock, showing them how to approach a horse with open palms and steady breath. He taught them to brush Thunder's coat, to listen for the animal's moods, to sense when to step back and when to reach out. Their awe was contagious, and Thunder, no longer a wild shadow, responded with gentle patience. Under Jackson's steady hand, the Mustang became a legend not just for his past, but for his gentle heart. As the weeks passed, invitations trickled in. Mrs. Callahan, the elementary school teacher, asked Jackson if he might speak to her class about horses. He hesitated at first, but the children's excitement swayed him. On the day of his visit, he brought Thunder to the schoolyard, where children watched wide-eyed as the Mustang circled, strong and graceful. Jackson demonstrated how patience and understanding could win trust, how even the wildest heart could learn to listen. The teachers marveled at the change in him, how easily he moved among the children, the softness in his eyes. What struck Jackson most was not the attention, but the way sharing Thunder's story seemed to lighten burdens he'd carried for so long. Soon after, the community asked him to help with other rescued animals, a stray dog, a pair of lost kittens, even a stubborn goat who refused to leave the neighbor's porch. Jackson accepted, learning the quirks of each creature, discovering how the same patience that had won Thunder's trust worked on the wary and wounded alike. His barn became a safe haven, a place of mending for both animal and human. The children started to linger, watching as he coaxed a frightened dog from hiding or soothed a sick lamb with careful hands. Each day, Jackson's world grew bigger, his loneliness replaced by quiet companionship and laughter drifting across the yard. Jackson's wood carving, once a solitary pursuit done in silence by the stove, became another way he connected to the community. When Mrs. Callahan asked if he'd donate carvings for the school fair, Jackson agreed. And soon his work, small horses, birds, bears, and even a likeness of Thunder, was in the hands of children and neighbors alike. His cottage porch was often scattered with sawdust and wood shavings, but the joy he saw on the faces of those who received his gifts made the mess worthwhile. With each passing week, the people of Maple Hollow brought their own stories to his doorstep. Neighbors who'd once been strangers now lingered over coffee, sharing memories, worries, or simple news of the day. Thunder, ever watchful, became a fixture at these gatherings, his presence calming, his legend only growing. Parents trusted Jackson with their children and their animals. Friends confided in him. The town came to rely on the man they once called the Phantom. As summer arrived, the transformation was unmistakable. Jackson's cottage, once a place of exile, became a gathering spot. On Sundays, neighbors came together for potlucks in his yard, sharing food and laughter as children raced through the grass. The barn doors stayed open late, golden light spilling onto the paddock, welcoming anyone in need of shelter or company. For Jackson, each day felt like a quiet victory. He took comfort in the small rituals, feeding Thunder at sunrise, tending his garden, teaching a child how to whittle a horse from a scrap of pine. He no longer shied away from the world, no longer hid his scars or his sadness. Instead, he learned to let people in, to share both the darkness and the light. Trust, he realized, was not given once, but earned each day in countless little ways. And Thunder, he flourished, his coat sleek and his eyes bright. The horse was no longer an outsider, but a symbol of all that could be healed. People from neighboring towns traveled to see the Mustang, and with each visitor, Jackson's story spread. The man who had once lived on the edge, who saved a child, who found hope in the most unlikely companion. Thunder's legend became Maple Hollow's own, a living testament to the town's belief in second chances. By the height of summer, Jackson knew he had built something lasting. Where isolation once ruled, now there was friendship, purpose, and pride. His cottage was no longer haunted, but filled with life. He was a teacher, a friend, a caretaker. And at the heart of it all, Thunder grazed contentedly, always near, a reminder that hope, once found, could be shared with the world. Late summer in Maple Hollow seemed to last forever that year. The days glowed long and golden, the evenings soft and cool, the whole valley breathing in a hush of contentment. It was the kind of season that made time feel slow and generous, like there would always be more days, more sunlight, more laughter to fill the world. For Jackson Bennett, every sunrise was a gift, every dusk a reminder of just how far he had come. From the shadow of a broken man at the edge of town to the center of a life remade by trust, kindness, and a wild Mustang's loyalty. The cottage had changed as much as its owner. The yard now showed the work of careful hands and hopeful hearts. A small vegetable garden crowded with beans and tomatoes, flower beds planted by neighborhood children, a repaired porch swing where visitors gathered in the cool of the evening. On weekends, the barn and the yard filled with neighbors and friends, potluck suppers stretching into the blue hours while children chased each other through the grass and Thunder grazed at the edge of the light, always nearby. It was easy, sometimes, for Jackson to forget what life had been like before. He moved with the rhythms of the town, early mornings feeding Thunder and tending the barn, afternoons spent teaching children about horses or carving gifts for the upcoming harvest fair. He listened to neighbors' stories, lent a hand when a fence needed mending or a sick animal needed care, and found himself woven into the fabric of Maple Hollow in ways he had never imagined possible. There were still quiet evenings, still moments when the old ghosts returned. But now they were balanced by the warmth of friendship and the gentle presence of Thunder, never far from his side. As autumn approached, Maple Hollow prepared for the harvest fair, a tradition older than any of its residents. This year, Jackson's name was at the top of every list, asked to carve the ribbons for the best pies, to help judge the horses in the parade, to bring thunder for the children's exhibition. He accepted each invitation with humble gratitude, still amazed at how readily the community welcomed him. The man who once kept to the shadows now stood at the heart of the festival, thunder gleaming with health and pride, a living symbol of hope and redemption. The fair itself was a swirl of color and sound, pumpkins and hay bales, games and music, the air rich with the scent of baked apples and cinnamon. Jackson moved easily among the crowds, smiling as children raced up to stroke Thunder's nose or tell him stories about their own pets. Adults shook his hand and asked for advice. Neighbors shared news and laughter, and every so often Jackson would look up to find Emily watching him, her eyes bright with the same wonder that had first brought them together. Her family stood nearby, their faces open and joyful, and Jackson felt a warmth in his chest that nearly undid him. The highlight of the day was the Mustang exhibition. Children from every corner of the county gathered to watch Thunder perform. Nothing too showy, just simple commands, gentle cues, and the kind of partnership that only comes from patience and trust. The crowd cheered as Thunder bowed, pranced, and let the smallest children brush his mane. Jackson looked out over the field and saw not strangers, but friends, all of them sharing in the moment. All of them part of something bigger than any one person or horse. As evening fell and lanterns lit the fields, Jackson slipped away for a moment of quiet, standing at the edge of the pasture where Thunder grazed. The Mustang lifted his head, ears pricked, and ambled over, pressing his nose into Jackson's shoulder. Jackson stroked Thunder's neck, feeling the strength beneath his hand, the steady heartbeat that matched his own. He remembered the night Thunder came to him, broken, wild, both of them battered by storms no one else could see. He remembered the first hard months, the small steps toward trust, the cold fear of judgment, and the aching hope for acceptance. And he remembered the moment he realized that saving Thunder had, in truth, saved himself. Looking out over Maple Hollow, Jackson saw the town as it truly was, imperfect, but capable of change, cautious, but generous. A place where old wounds could heal and new life could take root. He thought of the children who ran to greet him each morning, the neighbors who dropped by with coffee and news, the friends who had become family. He thought of Thunder, once a legend, now a companion and a friend, a living testament to all that was possible when you chose courage over fear, hope over isolation. As darkness settled and the last of the lanterns flickered against the blue night, Jackson felt a sense of peace unlike anything he'd known before. The past would never fully leave him. Some scars, he knew, would always ache. But he had learned that scars were not the end of the story. They were reminders of what had been endured, of the strength to begin again, of the power found in reaching out when all seemed lost. Jackson led Thunder back to the barn, the path lit by stars and the warm glow from his cottage window. The barn, once a lonely refuge, now hummed with the quiet presence of animals, laughter, and life. The cottage, once a place of exile, had become a true home. Before turning in, Jackson stood for a long moment at the threshold, Thunder standing steady beside him. He breathed in the night air, rich with the scent of hay and earth, and let gratitude fill him. Gratitude for second chances, for the kindness of strangers, for the stubborn, wild horse that had bridged the gap between past and present. For the first time, Jackson truly felt he belonged. not as the phantom of Maple Hollow, not as the shadow on the edge of town, but as a friend, a mentor, a neighbor, a man who had found his way home and who knew, deep in his bones, that he would never walk alone again. And Thunder, his companion through every season, remained at his side. Not just a legend, but a partner in hope, and a reminder that no storm, no matter how fierce, could last forever. In the gentle hush of night, surrounded by the place and the people who had finally become his own, Jackson smiled, the echo of joy carrying out into the dark, lasting long after the last light had gone out.